to Season 3 of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. This season will feature more peeking behind the scenes, pushing back at assumptions, and listening to the voices of the past. We'll have fun and fascinating guests and welcome your involvement in what we chat about. It's all part of shaking up history. We start with a focus on our favorite birthday girl, Queen Elizabeth I. All month, we'll consider this multifaceted woman who went from being baby heir to discarded daughter and from being suspected sister to Queen of England. Enjoy our journey through Elizabeth's England. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Joanne Paul, who is going to speak with us today about her amazing book, The House of Dudley, God, King, and Country. And it is a new history of Tudor England. And I know we all love Tudor England, so welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's so wonderful to be here. It's sort of the perfect podcast to talk about the Dudleys because they were royals, rebels, and romantics. So I think I tick all the boxes here today.
Yes, that is absolutely true, and that's very exciting for all of us. So tell us, besides being royals, rebels, and romantics, when you decided to write about the Dudleys, what drew you to this family in particular?
I think it was a question of almost pure curiosity of what the heck is going on with these people.
Right.
I had read Leicester's Commonwealth, which is the pamphlet which the book opens with in the prologue. This secret pamphlet that circulates the Elizabethan court that talks about this three generations of Dudleys and how they all end up on the block and how they're nuzzled from their infancy in treason and they're a tribe of traitors, and how really there's this culture within the family that teaches especially the boys and the young men be traitors. And obviously you think about that, okay, they're obviously not doing that, but something's clearly going on, because it is true that for three generations they get very, very close to the throne and then they end up on the executioner's block. So for me, it was just this question of what is going on in the internal dynamics of this family. What was it like to be a Dudley? What was the culture of their family? And how did this keep happening to them?
Well, that is so interesting because they do keep coming back. They don't stay away. They don't stay down. They reemerge and get just that close again. So that is a fascinating. I read somewhere in some of your research that when you were looking around the Tudors, the quote was, "Everywhere I looked, there a Dudley was," which is so interesting as you sort of look at the arc of the dynasty. So how do you think they kept coming back after
Yeah,
falls that seem pretty catastrophic?
yeah, you kind of just can't keep the Dudleys down, can you?
Right.
And the Tudor monarchs tried. Yeah, it was really interesting to me. I decided to write this book about this family, and I knew obviously some of the major moments for them. I knew the major characters, the main figures. In each generation, there's a main sort of male figure that we're all fairly familiar with. Edmund Dudley under Henry VII, who's executed by Henry VIII. John Dudley under Henry VIII, who is and Edward VI, who's executed by Mary I, and then of course Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. And so I had this sort of rough structure, but I thought that there would be periods, decades even, in which there wouldn't be much going on for the family. That I'd have to skip over quite a bit. And I thought particularly that would be the case under Henry VIII, that John Dudley doesn't really get up to much until the reign of Edward VI. And I was so incredibly wrong. And I was really happy to be wrong in that case, because they do just sort of turn up everywhere, and there is, you would think, something rather strategic in that. They know how to um, make themselves part of the fabric of the court, to make these connections, particularly by the time you get to John Dudley. Edmund's less good at this, which is why he ends up losing his head. But they know how to ingratiate themselves, how to almost enmesh themselves into everything that's going on. So you see John Dudley, the battlefields of France in 1523. You see him being involved in many of the court performances. The Castle of Loyalty, very famously. You see him in the procession for the christening of the Princess Elizabeth. His wife, Jane Dudley, is a lady to Jane Seymour. They're both in the household of Anne of Cleves, and so on and so on and so forth. I could go on forever, but there is a book that you can read if you want to find out more. Hey. But just this sense that that they're always there, which was very, very helpful to me as a writer, but also I think tells us something about how the court worked.
Right. And it's really interesting because there are some other families, and there's one in particular, the Howard family, the Duke of Norfolk and all of that with the Howards. But it seems to me, and they come and go too, right? They get really close and then fall and then come back and then fall. But it seems to me the Dudley relationships with the monarch, they just feel more personal than the Howards. The Howards always feel like they're at arm's length, even when they're in favor. Does that seem right to you? And how do the Dudleys manage these really close personal relationships? When I think of, even with Henry VII and Edmund, that was a really tight, small circle that Edmund Dudley was part of. And then, of course, John Dudley is close to Henry and then so close to Edward. So how do they get that personal connection?
There's so much in that question. I mean, first of all, absolutely right, I think, to compare the Dudleys to the Howards, not only because they both have treason multiple times in their family, the sense of falling and then rising, falling and getting close, and then having to back off again, but also because the Dudleys and the Howards were deep and committed enemies. And you see that through the book, that the Howards were this ancient family. They are conservative, religiously as well, fairly Catholic, whereas the Dudleys are these sort of up-and-comers, part of the new men that are brought in under Henry VII. And then they also ally themselves with what we now call Protestantism. And you see at various points the Howards taking any opportunity they can to bring the Dudleys down. And they possibly come to blows at one point. And Henry Fitzalan, who is married into the Howard fold, is really the one who possibly facilitates, or at the very least celebrates John Dudley's fall in 1553. So I think comparing these families makes a lot of sense. It's interesting what you say about being this personal connection, that the Dudleys seem to have more of a personal connection. I mean, I think in some cases that's true. It's also worth remembering, of course, that two Howards do marry Henry VIII.
Right. Yes. Yes.
So there, I think that the Dudleys and Howards do use some fairly similar strategies and techniques in terms of getting close to the House of Tudor. The Dudleys maybe are just famously more adept at it.
Right.
And we think too, of course, the biggest personal relationship, I suppose, the most obvious one is that between Robert and Elizabeth, which is probably very romantic and very long lasting.
Right. Okay, but before we get to that, and I do want to get to that.
Sorry.
but
Jumping ahead.
Just hang on. No, I know, because that's what we do want to talk about that. But let me just ask one related question to what you were saying. because you're right, of course, Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn from the Howard family both marry Henry VIII. But it seems like the Howards maybe are less united within themselves. The Dudleys seem to be united within themselves. By the time Anne Boleyn becomes queen, she and her uncle, Thomas Howard, have pretty much fallen out. Are the Dudleys maybe more united than the Howards?
I love that. Yeah, I love that point. I think there's something really to that. You get this sense in which the Dudleys, perhaps because particularly this line of the family, and I'll say more about that in a second, is fairly small. It isn't as
Right.
big a family. There aren't as many connections through marriage as the Howards have.
Right.
They are able to enforce this idea of the family and a family unit. And you see that especially when you get to Robert Dudley's generation and they're talking about the House of Dudley. And Mary Sidney, who is a Dudley, is telling her son, Philip Sidney, that he is a Dudley and he has to be loyal to that family. He describes himself as a Dudley, even though he's a Sidney, and so
Mm-hmm.
on. So there definitely is that sense. And there is this deep love that is evident when you look at the sources and the letters between the various members of the Dudley family. There is another line of the family, and they don't always get on quite so well. That's the Baron Dudleys, the Sutton Dudleys. They are the elder line of the family, so they keep the barony and the title, whereas this younger line has to sort of fight for
Oh,
its recognition. And so
okay.
the Dudley Castle is usually held by the elder line, but John Dudley gets hold of it for a while mid-century. But yeah, those two groups don't get on. But the Barons Dudley are just not very important
Right.
in the Tudor period, so you don't get that really obvious friction
Okay.
that you get with the Howards.
Okay. Yeah, that's just so interesting. I love just sort of peeling back and looking at that. That's wonderful. All right. Now, let's go where we all want to go, which is Robert Dudley and Elizabeth. And you mentioned this long-lasting relationship, which is one of the really amazing things about their friendship, or whatever you want to call it, that it does start young and lasts through several reigns and lots of trials, and yet right up till his death they are very close. So what can you tell us about that relationship and its long lasting nature?
I suppose the first thing is just a caveat that we don't actually know when this friendship begins. Later in life, Robert claims to have been very close with Elizabeth as a child. I think he says when she's 7, she's talking about not getting married,
Hmm.
um, and that he knew her then. That's possible. Certainly, the Dudleys being very important in the court of Edward VI and at the end of the reign of Henry VIII means that Robert and Elizabeth probably would have encountered each other at some point, but we just don't know. And
Hmm.
Robert's later claimed that he knew her back when. Well, he would have
Right.
reason to say things like that, and so we can be, if not dubious, a little bit critically minded, I suppose. The idea
Okay.
too that they met when they were in the Tower, because they were in the Tower at the same time under Mary. Again, there's no evidence that happened. No evidence that definitely didn't, but we just don't really know, and so we don't
Right.
definitely get them um, close to each other until Elizabeth's reign itself, when Cecil invites him to be master of the horse, and he rides through London with her. Um,
Hmm.
and essentially, they start what appears to be courting
Right.
very soon after. There must have been a pre-existing relationship, or that invitation never would have gone out. But we just don't really know what it was, which is fine and fun, and that's what fiction is for.
Hmm.
And fiction has
Hmm.
given us some wonderful ideas of what that could have been. But we just, as historians, we're just not that sure. Certainly,
Right.
though, from that point, we can trace a really tumultuous, as you say, but I think in the end, really sort of beautiful friendship over the decades. They appear what looks like courting, dinners in St. James Park, gifts of gloves. He takes her to
Hmm.
Chelsea, where his mother had died, and so on and so forth. It can't really be courting, of course, because at
Right.
the time Robert was a wife. And so, although there are all sorts of rumors that it is courting and that they will be married, that isn't possible while Robert is still married.
Right.
Shall I go
You
and,
know,
into that
I,
one, or do you have questions about
no,
that later on?
let's go on just because we happen to be recording this on the anniversary of Amy Robsart's death. So let's go
Yes.
ahead and take a look at that.
Yeah, so we are recording it as this just so happens
Hmm.
on the anniversary of the death of Amy Robsart. Amy Robsart Dudley, the
Dudley.
wife of Robert Dudley, who is found at the bottom of a flight of stairs, dead. And the circumstances around that are very mysterious, difficult to figure out exactly what happened. Um, we know from sources at the time that she had sent her servants away during the day to a fair in Abingdon nearby. This is near Oxford. And that's very surprising that she wanted them all out of the house.
Hmm.
It's possible that she'd been unwell previously. One of her servants suggests, she sort of defensively um, wants to defend Amy Robsart Dudley against the suggestion that she had killed herself. And that she certainly didn't do it by her own hand, which of course raises the question: did she?
Right.
So suicide becomes a possibility. A lot of eyes went to Robert that he did away with his wife in order to marry the Queen. Um, this is unlikely because, of course, the result was that it was very, very difficult for Robert to get anywhere near the Queen after that, because you don't really want someone who may have murdered his first wife to
Right.
marry the Queen of England. William Cecil comes in as someone who may have been involved because he appears to be spreading rumors about Robert doing away with his wife
Yeah.
before it actually happens. Or she may have just fallen down some stairs. So it's very difficult to know exactly what happened. Many other historians have dug through the sources and done our best with it. I think we all have theories and feelings about what it might have occurred, but we just can't know. But the end result, I think, is very important, which is that any suggestion that Robert might marry the Queen now becomes bogged down, essentially, by this history and by this suspicion of murder.
Right. And that is, I think, one of the reasons that people point to Cecil, because Cecil so did not want Robert to marry the Queen. And now it really becomes, in some ways, less likely because of the suspicious nature of the death. Is that right?
Absolutely. It people still talk about Robert marrying the Queen. There's all sorts of rumors that persist that he's about to, has already married the Queen, that a secret marriage is about to be performed, has been performed, that his marriage is a certainty, and so on and so forth. You take one look at the Elizabethan court, and basically all you can see are rumors. It's hard to pin
Hmm.
anything down. So those don't go away, but it would be incredibly difficult already for Elizabeth to have married someone who is the grandson, son, and brother of traitors.
Right.
To add that he might have murdered his wife just makes the whole thing that much more impossible.
Right.
which, as you say, is possibly a victory for William Cecil.
Right, right. And I do think, and so let me ask you what you think, because it seems to me Robert's especially up against it because of his family.
Absolutely, yeah. And this comes up again and again for Robert. It's not something we have to speculate about. We know that the sort of the Dudley legacy, this stain of the block, becomes a huge problem for him, because we see it mentioned. Um, we, in particular, of course, the greatest example is Leicester's Commonwealth, that pamphlet that I was talking
mhm.
about, where there is this sense in which Robert is the inheritor of this this legacy, this family of traitors, that he might even stand above the treachery of his ancestors, but certainly can't avoid being seeped in it. Um,
Right.
and so this association between Robert Dudley and the previous generation's treachery is a huge stumbling block for him in his relationship with the Queen. And I think that's one of the things that I, just go on a bit of a tangent for a moment. Well,
Mhm.
one of the things that I wanted to get across in this book is we have a tendency, I think, to break down the period according to reigns. And so,
Mhm.
we'll have a TV show or a film or a book or what have you about the reign of Henry VIII, and then another one that might cover Mary the First, and then a completely different one for Elizabeth.
Mhm.
And what that does, I think, is it makes it very, very difficult to understand intergenerational relationships and intergenerational legacy. And so when we watch a film, for instance, like the great film of Elizabeth with Kate Blanchett,
Mhm.
um, and there's difficulty in her just being able to marry Robert Dudley. It's hard for us to understand, I think, as viewers, what how difficult it is and why that
Right.
difficulty exists. I mean, 1560, when Amy Robsart dies, that's only 7 years after the succession crisis in
Mhm.
1553. That's
Mhm.
very recent, to the execution of his father. His
Right.
own, he was himself convicted of treason and might have been executed. His
Mhm.
brother was executed in 1554. This is all very, very recent memory for everyone living at that time. And I think it's really,
Right.
really important for us when we look at that period to be able to understand that.
Well, and that's really true because one of the things, of course, his father appeared to be doing was try to take over power through the reign of Jane Grey and Guilford Dudley, right? Um, and so maybe Robert is now making a play for power because there's this family tradition. So he's trying to marry Elizabeth and take over power. That's so potent, and you're right. We don't get that. And that movie was just actually on here in the States, and so I got to see it. But again, but you're right, we don't get any sense of that if we're only looking at Elizabeth's reign. So,
Absolutely. I mean, Robert himself rode out to capture Mary the First,
mhm,
right?
right.
He was one of the rebels. He is arrested. He's convicted of treason. He's sent to the Tower. He himself is a traitor. And it would make perfect sense to many people living in the period, that he's just trying to continue what he
Mhm,
had done just a few years before, in marrying the queen. And I mean, we might even
mhm,
look and think that he is right. I think we can think of Robert, and we look at Joseph Fiennes' fantastic performance with
right,
those
yes.
puppy dog eyes, um, but he may have been ambitious, and he may have been attempting to assert a sort of claim through Elizabeth.
Right. And there was such a baked in belief that Elizabeth should not be reigning on her own for all kinds of reasons. And just because she's a woman. So that's so accepted at the time that whatever man is by her side is going to have a great deal of power in a way that is different
Absolutely.
from today, right? So,
Absolutely. There's almost a paradox. Well, it's not. It is a paradox when it comes to female rulers in the 16th century. On the one hand, they must marry, and that goes for any ruler. I mean, their first job is to continue the line, so they must
mhm,
marry. They must have legitimate children, um, and so they carry that. Um, but then they also must marry because they're seen as insufficient, essentially, on their own, that they don't have enough prudence, political ability in order to make decisions on their own.
mhm,
But that then creates a problem
mhm,
because you still want the ruler to rule and not whoever they marry to rule. And so they
right,
must marry and they must be governed by their husband, who, of course, would govern them because they are their husband and
mhm,
they are the man, and they
right,
must do so. But they are going to inevitably have to also be a subject
right,
to the ruler, unless they're a foreign prince, and that's worse. Because then they're being taken
right.
over by a foreign power. So there is sort of no right way forward for a female ruler at that time when it comes to marriage. There is no right option. Um, Mary the First tries it. She marries Philip II. There's, as we well know, all sorts of
Mhm,
opposition to that. It might have worked in the long term, but in the short term, it creates a very fractious court, which actually the
right.
Dudleys take great advantage of.
Mhm,
But it creates all sorts of problems. And so for Elizabeth, it makes sense that well, if there's no right answer, I'll just stick with the way things
right.
are.
Mhm,
But Robert certainly would have been considered one of the wrong answers, the really
mhm,
really wrong answers in
mhm,
all sorts of ways.
right. But, and this is one of the things that you just can't help but love about him. He hangs on for so long. I mean, he just keeps trying for so long. He won't accept that premise that he's the wrong answer. And so I want to talk just for a minute about this marvelous the progress she makes to Kenilworth in 1575, and it's been called sort of his big public proposal. Do you see it that way? Do you think he's really just sort of laying it on the line? And I mean, he does so much work to just present her with this impossible to refuse request to marry him.
Yeah, the Kenilworth celebrations in 1575, I mean, first of all, are immense. The amount of money that is spent on this, I personally haven't done the calculations to work it out today. It'd be interesting, was that
Hmm.
a bigger party or Glastonbury? Like those sorts of
Right.
questions. How much exactly was spent? But it was incredibly lavish, and every penny that was spent in order to to both big up Robert Dudley and
Hmm.
big him up as sort of next to the Queen. But the exact relationship that he was trying to promote for himself next to the Queen, I think, is an open question. Certainly, there's evidence that he was still hinting at the possibility of marriage when it comes to Kenilworth celebrations.
Hmm.
But there's also a suggestion that in the course of these events in 1575, he's also trying to propose another sort of relationship, which is this unmarried power couple. And we see that, I'm very convinced by the work of Elizabeth Goldring on this. We see this in the portraits
Hmm.
that are presented at Kenilworth, where they are these matched portraits of Robert and the Queen. But they aren't married portraits. Married portraits, the pair would be facing each other. They're both facing the same direction. So there's this subtle suggestion that it might be the case that they're not going to marry, but they're still a couple, that they still are a pair, and that Robert is suggesting a new kind of relationship for them. Because, of course, at that point, Elizabeth is in her, I'm doing quick math, her early 40s. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And might not produce a child, although she continues to take suitors for years afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so the prospect of marriage is becoming more and more unlikely. Kenilworth might be this last ditch attempt. There's some fantastic poetry. We know so much about it. Um, when Elizabeth leaves, for instance, I'll just read a bit. Um, this figure of deep desire bursts into sort of poetic song, and desire. Robert had been represented by the figure of desire in other court pageants in the past. Desire says, "Then farewell, sweet, for whom I taste such sour. Farewell, delight, for whom I dwell in dole. Free will, farewell, farewell, my fancy's flower. Farewell, content, whom cruel cares control. Oh, farewell, life, delight, death, farewell. I die in heaven, yet live in darksome hell." And so, this idea that he is saying goodbye to her and to this possibility forever does
Okay.
seem to square with that. But we sort of just, I'm going to say we don't know again. It's awful.
Right.
But we really don't. Picking up though on your previous point about him holding on,
Mm-hmm.
certainly he doesn't marry again until after that point. And I
Right.
think that's quite important. We would expect a young man in good standing,
Mm-hmm.
who wants to continue his family line, to marry after the death of a first wife. And he doesn't. And in fact, he tells his mistress, Douglas Sheffield, that there's nothing he wants more than to marry and continue his line, except to keep the favor of the Queen. And so he's
Right.
obviously prioritizing that over this sort of personal and familial happiness that he
Mm-hmm.
could otherwise have.
Well, and it's interesting when we think of the family tradition of the Dudleys in terms of perpetuating their line. They have been, I don't want to say prolific parents, but they have tended to have nice big families that's under threat, right? As Robert is approaching this time, he needs to, kind of get going to have an heir pretty soon here, right? Is there some of that
Oh,
pressure?
precisely. Yeah. He talks about his sadness at being the last of his house,
Mhm.
because so his parents, John and Jane Dudley, have 13 children,
Mhm.
um, but five, have I got this right? Five die in childhood, and then four don't make it to the age of 25.
Mm.
So by the time you get to the reign of Elizabeth, it's just Robert, his elder brother Ambrose, and his two sisters.
Mhm.
And his sister, Mary Sidney, is the only one, it seems, who's able to have a family, to have children. But of course, they're the Sidneys. They're not
Right.
really the Dudleys anymore, despite
Right.
what she and her son Philip declare about themselves.
Right.
And that is how the line does continue. The Sidneys are still occupy Penshurst Place today. But the Dudley line, that particular Dudley line, does end, because Ambrose doesn't have any living children, Robert's elder brother, and
Mhm.
Robert only has one legitimate child, who dies young.
Right.
And at that point, it's sort of too late, to have more children. He does put the favor of the Queen above the chance to continue the Dudley line.
Okay, so let's just take that one step further. Why? So I'm going to ask something that as a historian it's impossible to know, but why might he have made that decision? Because at some point he's consciously making that decision, right? To put the favor of the
Yeah,
queen. And it's, I don't know, why would he put that ahead of continuing his family line?
I think that's a fantastic question, and we do know that he is aware of it. Certainly, at that point in the sort of the 1570s, 1580s, he is certainly aware that he has made that choice. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how much he's in the 1560s, early 1570s, he's aware of it. I'm not sure. He
Mm-hmm.
may just sort of think, "Well, I've got time. I'll deal with that later," or I might marry the queen. But
Right.
of
Okay.
course, I think one of the things that we can say is part of the culture of this family is service to the crown, and that might seem counterintuitive,
Mm-hmm.
given they're convicted of treason. But they are very, very dedicated to service. The currency, really, of the realm, of course, it's the pound, but the real
Mm-hmm.
currency
Right.
of the realm, or at least of the court, is favor and proximity to the monarch. And so retaining that becomes the ultimate goal. And Robert's not wrong. As soon as he marries, and as soon as that's found
Mm-hmm.
out,
Mm-hmm.
he is thrust out of the court. He's eventually let back. His wife never is. The queen is incredibly angry, as only Elizabeth I can be, and he
Mm-hmm.
does risk everything in marrying and having that one last ditch effort to produce a son and to continue the line. So it would make sense, I think, for Robert to prioritize the Queen's favor. It's just, I think it's very, very clear, and in a very emotional sense, when
Mm-hmm.
Robert changes tack and decides that actually he is going to risk the Queen's favor in order to have some hope of continuing the House of Dudley.
That's so interesting. And one of the things I thought of when you said, service to the crown is so important to this family. In fact, it seems to me that all of the quote treason comes from the next monarch not liking the way the family members served the previous monarch. So I think
Yeah.
Henry VIII kind of makes a scapegoat out of Empson and Dudley when he takes his father's throne, but they were doing what Henry VII said to do. John
Yeah.
Dudley was working very closely with Edward, and then Mary comes along and can't have that, right? Because she wants the throne. I mean, it just seems like it's their very service to one monarch that sometimes gets them in trouble with the next.
Oh,
So it's
absolutely. I think you've nailed it on the head there. Exactly. I talk sometimes about the Tudor monarchs needing the Dudleys, either to sort of stand upon and stand beside,
mm-hmm,
or to crush, right?
mm-hmm,
And to show their power. It's always in a regime change that the Dudleys end up in a fair bit of trouble. And you're absolutely right. It often has to do with following the exact letter of the king's will beforehand. So uh, Edmund Dudley, not a pleasant fellow in all sorts of ways, does some pretty unconscionable things, but he is doing what the king tells him to do. Now he probably could have done so without being quite as immoral,
right,
but he is doing it, um, and he becomes a very easy scapegoat um, for Henry VIII because he's so unpopular, because he
right.
doesn't make friends. Um, there's a sense in which one of the ways to survive those transitions of power is to ensure that you have other allies other than the monarch themselves, so that when they die, you are not
Mm-hmm.
left exposed. And Edmund Dudley doesn't do that. John Dudley does it once. He does it very
Right.
well once, because of course he does very well out of the death of Henry VIII, largely because he has forged those connections. He's protected by the Seymours, who become essentially all powerful in the reign of Edward VI. And so he manages that transition brilliantly. But the next transition, not so much, because whether through John Dudley's influence or not, and that's another we'll never know.
Right.
Um, Edward VI hands the throne to Jane Grey Dudley, John Dudley's daughter-in-law, And John, along with, it's worth mentioning, just about every other noble in the entire council, supports that choice. But he once again gets blamed because he has made himself unpopular again. It's
Right.
that lack of allyship that really leaves people exposed. So it's an interesting counterfactual.
Right.
Robert Dudley is setting himself up pretty well for if Elizabeth dies. He's already corresponding with Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
He, from very early on, seems to be interested in being the one that forges the connection between Elizabeth and first Mary Queen of Scots, and then later James of Scotland. And so he's trying to set himself up to
Right.
survive that transition of power, hopefully because he's learned a little bit from the mistakes of his predecessors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he just doesn't live long enough to do
Yeah,
that. Or
yeah,
maybe he
exactly.
thought Elizabeth lived too long. She does outlive an awful lot of people there at the
Yeah,
end.
his death is very very sudden.
Yeah.
He's still in very very good health. He's just weeks after the defeat of the Spanish Armada,
Mm-hmm.
and he's pivotal to that very famous Tilbury speech.
Mm-hmm.
May have the body of a woman, but have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England at that.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one who arranges that speech, and then is sure to have it recorded. It's the reason we know it today. And it's only weeks after that that he falls very suddenly ill and dies.
Right. And it does seem in his final correspondence with the Queen, there seems to be an expectation that he'll recover. It doesn't seem like they immediately knew it was that serious an illness.
No, not at all. He writes to her, thanking her for, I think she sends a bit of medicine or something for him, and he thanks her for that. And there's a sense of a sort of I'll see you very soon. He's traveling through Oxford. Sure, at the time, I believe it's following a similar sort of path that he had taken 4 years before, just taking a bit of time away from the court,
Mm-hmm.
and very suddenly falls ill, and passes away. And this letter, very famously, does reach the Queen, and she writes in her own hand his last letter, and it's still by her bedside when she dies in 1603.
Right. And that is just such a lovely personal touch of the level of friendship, whatever else it may have been, that it was so personal. She kept that with her. That's just very poignant, I think. Well, this has been so amazing, this journey through the Dudley family. Can you give us a sense of some of the other things you're working on and where we can find you and stay up to date with what you're doing?
Absolutely, but also no. I'm sorry, I can't actually say what the next project is just yet. I'm
Oh,
waiting for my team to give me the green light with a press release. But
cool.
there are two more books coming. Um, let's see. I can give a hint, which
Oh,
is
good.
that I'm working on a biography of someone who does appear in the House of Dudley, albeit briefly, and has a connection to where Jane Dudley died. And I'll leave it at that. And
Okay.
those of you who like puzzles can
Right.
can figure that out. It might, once you go, oh yeah, of course, of course. But I am working on that now, and hopefully, don't think it'll be ready to go out next year, but hopefully the year after that. But you can stay up to date with everything that I am working on my website, which is just joannepaul.com. I am on Twitter at Joanne underscore sorry, let me try that again, at Joanne underscore Paul underscore, and I'm also on Instagram at Dr. Joanne Paul. And I
Okay.
mean, the next big thing that I am doing is a bit of a book tour. So
Oh,
if you're in the UK, I'm at Chelsea, I'm at Guildford, I'm at Warwick, I'm in Cambridge, I'm in, did I say Guildford already? I'm in Guildford, I'm in Ilkley, I'm all over the place from the end of September into October. So have a look at the website and you can find all the details about how to get tickets to those events.
All right. And I'll just ask for those of us, and I do have quite a few listeners in the US as well as me. Are any plans to do any book tours in the US?
I hope so. So I'm Canadian. So I hope
Oh,
that there will
right.
be some opportunities to visit both our wonderful countries and to talk Dudleys over there. What I do know is that the book will be released in the US in March. You can
Okay.
already pre order it. So if you look at the typical ones, Barnes and Noble, it's on, of course, Amazon and a few others. You can find it's got a shiny new different cover to the UK one. So if you already ordered the UK one, you can order the American one as well because it's got a shiny new cover. Might have a few other added bits to it, and it will be released in March.
Well, that is great to know. And I know a lot of us in the US make good use of Book Depository to get the UK. So I love having UK and US covers. I can't tell you, it's probably embarrassing to tell you how many books I buy again just for a new cover. So this has been wonderful. The book is absolutely marvelous. If you don't have it yet, either wait for the US edition and pre-order it now so you'll have it the moment it's released. It's marvelous. And I want to thank you, Dr. Joanne Paul, for spending this time with us and getting us into this fascinating family who was right at the heart of power during this tumultuous time, reign after reign. They just kept coming back. And it's amazing to read about it from their perspective. And also, I just want to say just a quick plug, not just the men, but one of the things I love is we meet the women in the Dudley family, and they are fascinating as well. And I think we don't know them often as much. So thank you, thank you, thank you for that and for being here with us.
Oh, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to share it. Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned about the women. That was something I was very dedicated to making sure was a part of this book. And it was really easy to do because they are so important to the Dudley story.
Right. So thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll be back soon. Thank you for being part of Season 3 of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I appreciate your joining us. Please consider subscribing, sharing with a friend, and leaving a rating. And we would love to welcome you to the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics patron family. I'm really looking forward to shaking up history with you.